3 minutes after 10 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Today should be fun. I hope you had a nice weekend. I did, since you asked. Had an absolutely lovely time. I went to see the Vamps at the O2 last night. I don't know if you've ever seen them live. I've known these lads now for quite a few years, and they're still not 30. It's a little bit ridiculous that a 50-year-old man should have such a soft spot for such a young band. But what an amazing... You know, some gigs just get you. They just get... I took both my daughters, and they both brought friends. And it just... I apologise to anybody in row D or behind, in block 112 for the sight of me dancing. That is not something that I should really be inflicted upon anybody. But what an amazing concert that was. So thank you to James and Brad and Connor and Tristan for a really memorable night, a really lovely night on both the musical level and, for me at least, not sure my children would agree, on a familial level as well. If you get the chance to see them on this 10th anniversary tour, you really should. It's just really top quality live music. 4 minutes after 10 is the time. I digress. Freedom of movement, Keir Starmer, Brexit. I mean, it's like a sort of potpourri of hardy perennials, isn't it? Oh, and massive worker shortages on this occasion in the NHS. The price of Brexit is the headline on one front page this morning. 4,000 fewer European doctors work in NHS. Shall I tell you what happens in Idiot's Corner at a moment like this? No? Oh, OK, then, since you insist. So in Idiot's Corner now, somebody points out that... oh, look, there's a shortage of doctors in Germany as well. And that proves that the shortage of doctors here has nothing to do with Brexit. Now, I don't know that my average listener needs me to explain the idiocy of these arguments or indeed the desperation of them. The desperation is incredibly easy to understand. But if there are shortages across several territories, then the territories in which the shortages are going to be less acute are the territories that can benefit from freedom of movement. If you turn off one tap and then start complaining about a shortage of water, pointing at other people who've got 10 taps, of which 1 or 2 have just been turned off, is, anyway, you understand. So Brexit has worsened the NHS's acute shortage of doctors in key areas of care and led to more than 4,000 European doctors choosing not to work in the UK. So take that headline. And then take this one. Starmer rules out a return to freedom of movement in EU, which was an interview he gave yesterday to the Mail on Sunday. That's interesting for 2 reasons. It's interesting in the first case because he gives interviews to the enemy, or he gives interviews to the traditional enemy. I appreciate some people aren't ready to accept this yet, but if you want to have a hope in hell of winning a general election from even a vaguely left-wing position in British politics, you and it pains me, I don't like it. I speak of the world in which I live, not the world in which I would choose to live, given absolute autonomy. You have to woo the enemy. You have to at least attempt to move the conversation onto ground that you would perhaps rather not tread on. And I hope that Keir Starmer would agree with that. I'm not sure. The other reason why this is interesting is that it means, and what are we, probably 2 years out from a general election, but this means Starmer is serious. And this is quite weird for those of us who felt that he was a little bit too soft around the edges for the cut and thrust of politics, or who felt that he was a little bit too nice, perhaps, or felt that he was a little bit too woolly. You don't need to show your teeth until it's time for tea. There's no point showing your teeth 3-4 years out from a general election. But when the fear that your opposition leader has no teeth begins to kick in, then the damage can be existential. So take it from me, Starmer doesn't just want to win, he wants to win huge. This, I think, is a remarkable signalling of intent. There's several strands to it. Some of them I'm profoundly unhappy about, and some of them I'm marginally less unhappy about. He is clearly determined to win and win huge. And to win huge, he needs to try this tactic of banking the support of people who are profoundly offended by the rather jingoistic direction of traffic that politics in this country has taken over the last 6 or 7 years. So he's going to bank their support But also, in order to not just win, but win huge, he needs to keep sweet people who have fallen for that rhetoric, people who have drunk that Kool-Aid, people who have been persuaded by some of the lies of Brexit. And I think this is a fascinating tightrope for him to walk, and probably the right one if you prioritise above everything else not just winning, but winning big. He's going to have to win the votes of people who think that there are too many foreign workers in the United Kingdom. He is going to have to win the votes of people who have been persuaded that the reasons why their own lives are not as replete with wealth and fulfillment as they might have liked is somehow the fault of foreign workers. Now, I don't believe that that's true. But I think you'd allow me to suggest that few people have tried harder over the last few years to persuade other people in that category, people who think that problems in their own life are all caused by foreigners. Few people have tried harder than me to win that argument, and I've got to tell you, it's very, very, very hard to win that argument. The queue for the ghost train is always a million times longer than the queue for the speak your weight machine. So Starmer is essentially now going after the queue for the ghost train. But he's not telling them that ghosts don't exist. He is respecting the validity of their decision to queue up for the ghost train. He is treating as legitimate their concerns about the contents of the ghost train. He has abandoned his previous position of seeking to speak their weight to them and tell them what the actual score was. Look at the statistical support, look at the evidence, look at the facts. If he wants to win big, he needs to bring these people with him, even if these people are, what are you going to call them? People still persuaded that abolishing their own freedom of movement is a win because it means there'll be fewer Johnny foreigners knocking around wherever it is that you work. But he doesn't just want to win, he wants to win big. He wants to win huge. And this is how he thinks he will. For the record, my long-held theory that eventually we'll bring it back, but we'll call it something like liberty of motion, still stands. I think, looking at the story now, it may well be that Keir Starmer probably turns out to be the person to bring back liberty of motion. It will be clipped and it will be cut and it will be curtailed and it will have parameters and it will have conditions and it will be sold to the people that Keir Starmer is now seeking to woo as being points-based or as being very much tailored to our needs. The conversation that we had a few times between 2016 and 2020 about how almost everything they said we had to leave the European Union to do could easily have been done in the European Union is now over. That conversation is finished. Even James O'Brexit wouldn't want to be resurrecting those conversations anymore because the people who were right about the facts lost the argument. They lost the argument to the people who were strong about the feelings. That's not sour grapes. That's not an opinion. That's just counting. You could do these things in the European Union, but the people who believed that you couldn't, they won the argument about whether we should leave. And Starmer was very much one of the people making the argument about how you could do all these things and freedom of movement was valuable. In Jeremy Corbyn's shadow cabinet, it was Keir Starmer who pushed for the party to back a second referendum and for remaining in the EU to be an option. He gave it his all and he lost, which makes this a politically fascinating moment because I worry I'm footballified on this one. Forgive me, I'm so keen to see the back of the Tories that I worry I might have my own scarf tied so tightly around my neck. If I was leader of the Labour Party, I would not be doing what Keir Starmer is doing. But I think that by doing what he's doing, he is likely to win much bigger than he would do if he didn't do what he is doing. Does that make sense? I hope it does, because I think it does. And I think it's a really important conversation that we're about to have. Because you could accuse him of epic hypocrisy. You could accuse him of an epic betrayal of many of the platforms that he either campaigned on or we presumed he would continue to hold in the event of becoming leader of the Labour Party or perhaps Prime Minister. However, the other way of looking at it is this. He lost. We lost. The argument is over. The country was persuaded that the abolition of its own freedom of movement was desirable. Keir Starmer did his best to reverse that decision democratically, and he failed. So what does he do now? Does he seek to govern a country in which he only recognises the will of the people who agree with him, even though they're in a minority? Or does he seek to govern a country that has made a democratic decision to abolish its own freedom of movement? Or rather, that sees the abolition of its own freedom of movement as a price worth paying for keeping out a largely mythical army of foreigners who wish us ill or foreigners who do us harm? It doesn't matter whether it's mythical or not anymore, because 52% of the country believe that it exists, or did do. It's mad, again, to look at the numbers who still support the idiocy of Brexit, just at a time when Keir Starmer is sort of doubling down on it. One very strong text has already come in. The argument is never over in a democracy, says Dave. No, but it's over for a cycle. It's over for a period, Dave. You can't campaign to become Prime Minister on a pledge to reverse something that the last Prime Minister was elected on. Not when it goes beyond policy or beyond party politics. At least I don't think you can. But hey, I don't know. This is what I mean about worrying that I'm a bit footballified today. Maybe I'm trying too hard to make excuses for Keir Starmer, even as I describe this particular policy flip-flop as disgusting, disappointing, heartbreaking. I don't want to be a country that raises barricades. I don't want to live in a land that pulls up drawbridges. I don't want to be part of a weird little island that's shutting itself off from the rest of the universe in pursuit of jingoistic, fetishized insularity, instead of recognizing that if we want the economic growth we so desperately need, we need to be an open trading nation. I don't like any of this, but I want Keir Starmer to win the next election. I think you have to be very strange not to, given the 12 years that the other lot have had to do their thing. And just have a look at how that's working out for you and everyone you know. Unless you're Michelle Mone, of course. She's done all right out of it. But for everybody else I can think of off the top of my head, they've had 12 years. You've got to give someone else a chance. But, you know, he knew. This is politics in its purest form. He knew and he knows that leaving the European was ridiculous. Leaving the European Union was a stupid thing to do. He knew and he knows that it was a decision driven largely by racist lies. Remove Nigel Farage and his despicable pronouncements from the entire Brexit debate, and even Dominic Cummings wouldn't have got it over the line with his different brand of lies. Albeit that some of the lies from Vote Leave were racist as well. The NHS stuff and the idea that you'd suddenly be able to get seen in a nanosecond if we could only get rid of all these foreigners. Well, you got rid of all the foreigners, 4,000 bloody doctors off the top of my head. So remove the racism from the Brexit debate and it would never even have gone to the wire. You know that, and I know that. You might be a little less comfortable with that knowledge than I am because, you know, you fell for it or you got into bed with them, but that's just a given. That's just a fact. And Starmer knows all of this. I'm haunted now by Dave's text. He's completely undermined my entire introduction. The argument is never over in a democracy. It's not over forever, but in this electoral cycle, Keir Starmer has called time on the entire argument. How do you feel about that? 0345 6060 973. Sir Keir Starmer has said he would not rip up Boris Johnson's Brexit deal, even as, what's his name, Brexit hardman Steve Baker gave an interview last week in which he signalled the desire to reopen it, to renegotiate the Northern Ireland Protocol element of the so-called deal that Boris Johnson didn't really secure. It's incredible, that. So you've got Sir Keir Starmer saying he'd never rip it up, and you've got Brexit hardman Steve Baker saying we need to open the box again. We need to go back to the negotiating table. Of course, the EU don't currently have a negotiator in that sense. They'd have to bring Šefčovič back into a slightly different role. Incredible, really. Sir Keir Starmer has said he would not rip up Boris Johnson's Brexit deal or, crucially, bring back freedom of movement. I guess I'm arguing he had no choice. Tell me I'm wrong on 0345 6060 973. Tell me what you think about it in general on 0345 6060 973 and tell me whether Keir Starmer's just lost or won your vote. And here's a question for the ages. What do you think this phrase or this sentence means? Defend free movement as we leave the EU. That was one of Keir Starmer's 10 pledges when he was seeking to become leader of the Labour Party. Can you defend something that's already gone? I don't know. Do I sound like a spin doctor now? You can't defend something that's already gone. He did defend it. He lost. But now he's pledging not to bring it back. Does that make him a hypocrite or a pragmatist? Or possibly both? John's in Swansea. John, what would you like to say?
Oh, hi, James. Thanks for having me on.
You're welcome, John.
I'm going to play devil's advocate if you'll permit me to.
I will. I just need to double-check what you're about to say is what you mean.
Oh, of course it is.
Well, then you're not being
100%.
devil's advocate then. Sorry to be pedantic about it.
I'll rephrase it. Yeah, okay. Well pointed. No, I completely understand what you're saying about Starmer, and any future Prime Minister wants to draw in votes from both sides. I get that, and I think most people do. However, I think he's Mr. Blinder.
Yeah.
I really, really do.
Because of the needle moving, right?
Well, yeah, and also, you only have to walk around the hospitality industry, go to your dentist, the GP surgeries, the hospitals. You see signs up, vacancies, some people wanting staff. You can't get to your dentist, you can't get to hospital because there's no staff. There are queues everywhere. It's all around us, white noise. We're witnessing it, all of us are. And I think actually, certainly all Remainers who voted Remain would still vote Remain. That's obvious. That's a blinder. But I mean, the people who voted Brexit, I think you'd find an awful lot of them, or some of them, a significant number, would now realise they've made a huge mistake and would actually go the other way.
Yeah, they might do, but not necessarily on this. So here's an interesting statistic, which with an incredible display of amateurism and unprofessionalism, I read this morning, and I can't remember where I read it. But I must have read it I must have read it somewhere reputable, given the source material that I consult before coming on air every morning. So there is currently a majority of people that think we need more migrant workers in specific areas, and a majority of people that think there are too many foreign workers in the country. That is the riddle that Keir Starmer has attempted to address, and that's why it's not quite the no-brainer that you see it as.
Yeah. So are we talking more focused migration, allowing people to come in certain trades and not in others?
Yes, and one never knows how much of that is a fig leaf and how much of that is fact-based, because one thing I've discovered doing this job, people are desperate to be able to say something other than, I don't like foreigners. They love to be able to say Australia, the biggest racist you'll ever meet, generally say Australian points-based immigration system, but equally, there is a case for arguing that we don't need people turning up and looking for a job. We do need people coming to fill a job that already exists.
Yes, although I have to say, those people turning up looking for a job would probably find one.
Yeah, so, I mean, personally, I'm not. I think, particularly in the current economic climate, I think they should be made welcome. But I'm just. Well, go on.
There's two groups of people coming out. There's two groups of people living here who would tentatively perhaps go for a dare I say, another referendum, or would vote.
But that's not going to happen.
No, I know it's not.
And I am James O-Brexit, and I don't think it should happen. We missed it. We blew it. We had a chance, and it didn't work.
The time will come.
Yes, it will come.
James,
but until it comes, what should Keir Starmer do? Pledge to rip it up? I mean, all he's done is say, I won't rip it up. The opposite of that is saying, I will rip it up.
Well, that's right. But there are two groups of people really here, aren't there? There are those that never really, the normal people who don't see people coming here as a threat and don't see people coming here to live off our benefit system and just coming here to find work. And there's nothing wrong with that. That increases the economy and growth, yeah?
Yeah, of
and there
course
are those who think that it's a nightmare. People are coming here to suck off our tentative benefit systems and live off or whatever, and there are those are the people that I'm hoping and the numbers will turn.
Yeah, the numbers are negligible, as you know, but the emotional impact of it is absolutely enormous, and then you can throw in the disgusting lines about not wanting to live next door to them, which the National Front was doing back in the 70s and Nigel Farage was doing back in 2016. 26 minutes after 10 is the time. Surely Starmer can't promise anything else until he is in power and can actually sit down with the EU as leader and negotiate anything different. Yeah, it's a good point, Michael. Thank you, John in Swansea. The language is important, isn't it? He's pledged not to rip up Boris Johnson's Brexit deal. What does that actually mean? And while we're talking about the meaning of sentences or the meaning of phrases, what does it mean to say that we will defend freedom of movement as we leave the EU, which Keir Starmer was saying in 2019. The number you need, of course, is 0345 6060 973. Stephanie's in Harlow. Stephanie, what would you like to say?
I was just listening with interest to what the previous gentleman was saying. But my view is a bit more simple, really. I just think that Keir Starmer is playing. I think he's playing a blinder. I think he's playing the long game. Yeah, absolutely. I've said this for years. He's not doing what the Tories would love him to do. They would love him to start making noises about changing things with Brexit and freedom of movement, and they'd be all over it. They'd start a culture war. And
I mean, they tried anyway, didn't they? Johnson and even Sunak in his first or second PMQs accusing him of things that are just not true when it comes to wanting to reverse Brexit. Almost. So it must still poll among the votes that he needs. The idea that portraying Starmer as somehow wanting to undo Brexit must still work for them, and he is seeking to shoot that fox. The alternative, though, is that they're moving on to he's now dancing to their tune. That's the alternative analysis.
I think he is.
Yeah, I do. I don't like that.
I don't know. I think he's holding his nose and doing what he has to do, because I think if he does anything other than this, I think we'll have another Brexit election. We'll be back in 2019.
Yeah, you're absolutely right, aren't you? That's exactly what it is. In fact, that in many ways, that's the skeleton key to unlock this whole conversation. It doesn't make me feel any better about seeing him abandon a principle I consider to be, actually, I'm going to go a bit dewy-eyed now. I think it's a beautiful principle, freedom of movement of people. I think it's a wonderful thing. I think it promotes peace and prosperity. But you're right, if he didn't do this, then they'd go in 2024 on the same debate as last time. Vote Starmer, vote Tory to keep Brexit done, not to get Brexit done. They'd do it again, wouldn't they? Of course they would.
Exactly. I think that's exactly what's on. I think it's that. And I think for that reason, I think Starmer's playing a blinder, because people are saying, yes.
Gosh. All right, I'm going to write that down as this is Stephanie's theory of the 2024 election, is that if Starmer didn't do what he is doing, then the campaign slogan in 2024 for the Tories would be an evolution from get Brexit done, and it would instead be keep Brexit done, just as boneheaded and bad for the country, but it got them an 80-seat majority in 2019. If it can get them half that in 2024, it will be job done. So in order to diffuse the keep Brexit done bombshell, Keir Starmer has to do what he's doing. Thank you, Stephanie. Simon makes an excellent point from Cheltenham. Careful, James, he writes, that interview was meant for a certain part of the electorate, not for your audience. I'd imagine he's going to try to boil the frog on this one, so let's not alienate Labour voters. I think you're probably right. I don't know whether you caught my full introduction, Simon, but the idea that he has to attract voters who are not currently on side involves hoping that you can somehow keep the voters who are on side, even as you improve the offer for people with whom they would historically disagree, often quite passionately. It's coming up to 10:30. Holly Harris is here now with the headlines. It is 10:34 and you're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Couple of texts. Freedom of movement, Annie reminds us, works both ways, James. I want my grandchildren to have the rights to work and study elsewhere that I and my children enjoyed. Same here, Annie, although, we are not a representative constituency. The number of families who contemplate studying abroad or possibly even working abroad at the moment is quite small. If we see a return to the kind of labour movement we had in the 80s with loads of British construction workers making their way to continental Europe, then obviously that will become a more acute observation. But right now, I don't know that it is Keir Starmer. The votes he needs are not clearly the votes of people who valued their own freedom of movement. Otherwise, they wouldn't have celebrated having it abolished. Gigi's in Reading. Personally, I've lost all hope in spineless Starmer. Like you, I'm desperate for a change in government. I really thought he would be different and see what a big mistake Brexit was. But now who on earth do we vote for? I guess, Gigi, I'm talking to you today because we lost and he can't keep. It's hard enough for a gob on a stick. It's hard enough for Britain's best loved broadcaster to keep pointing out the idiocy of Brexit. Even I get a little bit bored of it sometimes. My motivation on that is if you don't point out the lies that the last victory were built on, then new lies will build a new victory. When I started making that prediction, I didn't know that Boris Johnson would win a majority of 80 seats in the 2019 election off the back of lies as big as Brexit. But I mean, there's vindication and then there's vindication. If Carlsberg did vindication, the 29 election result would be a vindication of my insistence that you have to keep pointing out the lies, otherwise the lies will go on to bigger and better things. Problem was, we were a tiny voice in that debate and a lonely voice. So he knows it was a terrible mistake, but he thinks, well, there's two readings of it. Either he's supremely cynical and he just wants the votes of people who still think it was a good idea, even though he thinks it was an awful idea, or he is a lawyer and the verdict's been handed down. There's no right of appeal. That's it. So now you've got to mitigate. Now you've got to legislate for the new reality, the post-verdict reality. And the post-verdict reality is freedom of movement has been abolished and we are no longer in the European Union. And the terms of our departure from it have been largely defined, although I suspect Starmer Light Brexit hardman Steve Baker will be very, very keen to get back around the negotiating table. The key message for Mail on Sunday readers yesterday was we won't be seeking to reverse freedom of movement. And how big a deal is that? 0345 606 0973 is the number that you need. John's in Edinburgh. John, what would you like to say?
Morning, James. How are you doing this morning?
Pretty good, actually. But I mean, it's a good political conversation. I just wish we didn't have to live here. I wish we could have a few years of sort of peace and calm and general good. But hey-ho, I suppose it's even more febrile for you up in Scotland.
Well, this is exactly the point, is I have gradually moved away from Labour. I'm what you would probably call a traditional Labour voter. I've ended up voting SNP last few elections. If there was another independence referendum, I would have gone from a no to a yes. Should that happen?
Can I ask
and
why?
A large part of
briefly.
Well, it was a large part of what went on with New Labour, the movement to the centre area, the movement bringing in. We're still seeing the repercussions of things like PFI initiatives on hospitals and things like that. And you're right to say it's about who wins as much as anything else. But what really wound me up about the general political context is the longest. The only Labour government in my lifetime, I'm in my mid-40s, and the only Labour government in that lifetime, and which managed to sustain that period as well, was one where the reality was to win that whopping majority, they had to move into a central ground. I wasn't that comfortable with, being honest with you. I'm not. I wasn't, someone who wanted everything that Jeremy Corbyn wanted, but I was more comfortable to the left of where Blair's Labour was, and I don't feel there's a party that can win in a UK context for me with those policies, and that makes me quite sad. But
so you just double down on independence then, inevitably, or not double down, but it becomes the light at the end of this particular tunnel because the tunnel keeps changing.
Yeah, so two reasons. The first one was one I already explained, where it's like if you had that political context just in Scotland, I suspect the parties would all have to align themselves slightly more left-wing. I don't think it's as stark a difference as sometimes some people here like to make out. But of course, the thing with Brexit has also informed that decision since quite strongly. I've got quite a few friends who've relied on their Irish grandparents and so on to get the dual passports and all of this side of things. And I think we're going to be, if I could do anything to get back into that single market and freedom of movement, that would be my
well,
desire.
Up in Edinburgh,
I just don't see it happening.
Oddly, that you're calling from there, because one of my favourite tweeters, a chap called Andrew Levy, is tweeted yesterday, the fatal problem with the Starmer approach, as described, is that it assumes the UK can work its way under a Labour government through a bit of stagnation and decline. And in the end, I think 60s, before the UK joined the EEC, all will be well. But to the contrary, the politically and economically destabilising effects of being outside the EU structure creates an appreciable risk of UK state failure, which can't be addressed without rejoining the customs union and single market or substantially identical arrangements. And it's hard at the moment to see what those arrangements could be without entailing some form of freedom of movement, even if we decided to call it liberty of motion. And that is not what the next election is going to be fought on, though, is it? The next election is going to be fought on this territory, and pledging now to reverse the abolition of freedom of movement would lose him votes, except doing the opposite has lost him yours.
Yeah, exactly. And it's a sad situation. I can't put it better than that. Is fantastically well phrased, and I think it's accurate.
Yeah, that's why they pay me the silly money, John. Have a great day. It's 22:11. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Let's go to Italy next. Montefino. Carol is there. Carol, what would you like to say?
Good morning, James.
Hello.
I'd just like to say that Keir Starmer can't restore freedom of movement. He can only restore it in one direction.
Yes, that's very
true. Because it's up to the EU to allow the Brits in, and if they don't, the Tories at the next election will say, he's just opening the borders.
I suppose,
it's not restoring your freedom of movement,
no,
it's just bringing in more people.
He's absolutely not. I suppose I mean, to read it in the whole, essentially, he's saying, I won't do anything, I won't renegotiate Brexit in a way that would entail the return of freedom of movement, which would be in both directions. So, single market, customs union membership. I don't think Schengen's ever going to be on the agenda, but it was more. I mean, actually, your point's brilliant, but not necessarily for the reasons that you think it is. because I think liberty of motion, which is what we're going to end up with almost inevitably, is one way. That will involve us having to beg, essentially, for workers to come here from anywhere, and gravity dictates that the best place to ask for them to come from is the places that are currently nearest to us. So we will have that. But as you rightly point out, it won't be reciprocal. So what he's pledging to do is not do the reciprocal thing and instead to do what you describe. And the Tories aren't going to be able to campaign on that because they've already persuaded people that their own freedom of movement was something they should celebrate the abolition of.
Yeah, it'll come back to immigration.
Will it?
It'll come back.
It's just expats like you. It's just and middle class cliches like me who want their children to go to the Sorbonne. There's no election victories in us, Carol.
Well, I've already voted with my feet left.
Exactly that. Well, I mean, lucky you to have that opportunity, and lucky me to be Irish or Irish enough to get an Irish passport. 10:42 is the time. Veronica is in Sutton. Veronica, what made you pick up the phone?
I really want Keir Starmer to win the next election, like hopefully majority of the country does. But I can't understand why he wants to come out with these statements now. I mean, what's behind it? I mean, because I get it, he's got to play the long game, and one of your other contributors said it, he's playing a blinder and everything because he's got to, appeal to the red wall voters, et cetera. But why now? I mean, unless
I can answer that, I think.
Yeah, well, yeah.
But do you want to finish first? Sorry.
I would say, well, unless he thinks that Sunak may call a flash election, which I think would be my version suicidal for the Tories anyway.
It would at the moment.
Yeah, but I can't, because if I was him, it's like a game of chess. He's got to play the long game and show his cards when an election is called and put it out in the manifesto, something like that, because I think the economy is getting so bad, and that you give us another year of every sector, every business person will tell you the number one issue they have, and you know this, you've said it yourself, is shortage of staff, and at all levels.
So you think that and the latest he can call it is January 2025. You think that
the situation will be so desperate, yes.
Yeah, I mean, the answer to your question is, as I'm sure you know already, is the thingamajig, the rhetoric, the politics, the PMQs, the accusation that he wants to reverse it, which is a calculation. He has made that calculation that however bad things may be by the time of the next general election, my prospects in that general election will be damaged by the accusation that I want to undo Brexit or that I want to bring back freedom of movement. I take you to Stephanie's slogan. Keep Brexit done. If they can get 80 seats on Get Brexit Done, I think they could get 30 or 40 on Keep Brexit Done. And the intrinsic to that campaign would be the portrayal as Starmer as someone who wants to undo it. So I think he's gone early, but I don't think he's gone too early. I think he is now distancing himself, detaching himself from the inevitable accusation that he wants to undo Brexit. It's weird because although many people, a huge majority of people now think Brexit is going very, very badly, it's a smaller majority that would want to undo it. There's a lazy presumption that just because people have got a negative view of how it's going, that they would want to hop in a DeLorean sports car and turn back time. You've got, your Daily Telegraph constituency who think it's going badly because everybody else is at fault, and the people who campaigned for it are the least responsible for it of all. And then you've got people who think, well, it could have gone better if only this, and it could have gone better if only that, and it's the Remainers' fault, and it's Gary Lineker's fault, and it's Meghan Markle's fault, and it's James O'Brien's fault. I mean, but he's got to detach himself from the accusation that he wants to reverse it and undo it.
Yeah, but there's even Tory Brexiteers who are bringing up the topic regarding, well, maybe we should reconsider the single market. You know, I mean, the economic impact. I mean, and you know,
and look how that blew up, and that reportedly was Jeremy Hunt, who doesn't technically qualify as a Tory Brexiteer, although he's.
I know. Yeah,
but that was him, because he's a pragmatist, and he sees the idiocy of being out, but it's electoral poison still. And if the red wall proves pivotal again, then keep Brexit done. You've seen what the other fellow, the orange one. You've seen what Donald Trump has done.
Yeah.
He'd make America great again, and then he came out with a variation on that slogan last week, which was sort of make America great again.
But can I counter that?
Of course.
By Starmer coming out early, like he is now, and I get it, because you know the Labour Party is still reeling from the loss of the red wall, but you've got the Liberal Democrats who, I mean, I'm hoping there'll be some tactical voting next time the election comes, so it's not going to be like a circular firing squad. But nonetheless, if there's a Labour Lib Dem seat, and there are some, especially in some of the areas, and they may end up having to go with a coalition with the Lib Dems. I mean, that might not be a bad thing, I don't know, but nonetheless. So in some ways, he may gain on one hand, but he may lose on the other.
And true, that's very true, and that's the calculation, isn't it? That's the gamble. The question of how many people will he hemorrhage? We've heard from a couple, one in Scotland, one not, and you just don't know. There's no way of measuring it. It'd be interesting to see what the pollings do. 61%, Peter tells me, speaking of polls, want to rejoin now. I haven't seen that poll, Peter. I've got no reason to doubt what you're telling me, but the number who think it's gone badly, I suspect, will be even higher. It's not an option. That's the point. I don't like it any more than you do, but it's not an option. You cannot, I don't believe, campaign for Downing Street in 2022 on a ticket to undo the Brexit that came into effect in 2020 in any meaningful way. I wish you could. I'd probably give it a go, and I'd lose. Starmer wants to win, and he really wants to win. 10:47 is the time. 10:52 is the time, and I've mentioned to you a couple of times that some of the major talking points of the moment seem to be being delivered directly from 1980s school debating societies. In America, the abortion conversation has come horribly back to prominence. Thankfully, we haven't had the death penalty yet in this country, although there were moments when the UKIPification of the Tory party was in full swing, when it looked as if we might. But as an indication of perhaps how spooked the right-wing media is by Keir Starmer and his controversial attempts to eat some of their lunch with regard to Brexit and freedom of movement, the Daily Mail today is trying to resurrect the private education argument with Keir Starmer's pledge to introduce VAT on school fees, which I think is pretty much impossible to quibble with. And I speak as someone who's going to be hit quite hard by it. But I don't see how you could morally defend the idea of private schools, fee-paying schools, having charitable status. It's the one thing, if you were kind enough to read my last book, How Not to Be Wrong, The Art of Changing Your Mind, it's the one area where, personally, I have to put my hands up and say I'm a hypocrite. It shouldn't exist at all, but for as long as it does, I would spend my last penny on trying to provide my children with the best education possible. It's how my dad raised me. It's why I'm here today. It's why I have the job and the life that I have, because my dad bought me a golden ticket that he could ill afford. My mum and dad bought me a golden ticket that they could ill afford. And I used to be able to muster up a vague defence of private education on the grounds that kids like me should be breaching the citadel. We should be getting into those buildings where we would once have been considered riff-raff. But I'm afraid that claiming charitable status on those buildings, or rejecting the idea that there should be tax payable on it, VAT payable on it, in the same way that you pay VAT on the car that you chose to buy instead of sending your children to private school. I don't think I can defend it. And right now, I don't think you can either, but we'll find out after 11 o'clock. Back to Keir Starmer, back to this question. Philip writes, pragmatic gravity will force the UK back into the EU at some stage. Starmer knows this. So there are two conversations underway, whether you realise it or not. Conversation number one is about the electoral cycle, the pragmatism, the pursuit of power. Conversation number two is a little bit more speculative, because that's hinges on the optimistic view that he knows we're going to be heading back, whether we're going to call it liberty of motion or whether we're going to join the single market in 10 years' time or less. I don't think it will be less personally, but you never know. I don't know that you can prove that. I don't know that he would concede that or admit that privately, but I understand why you want it to be true, Philip, and so do I. Sam's in Clapham. Sam, what would you like to say?
So I actually think he's played it even better than we are anticipating or sort of guessing at.
Go on.
So I think it's all about this recent threat from Nigel Farage and the general chatter coming from him that he might be ready to enter mainstream politics again. So
I haven't seen that. You'll forgive me for not paying the blindest bit of attention to what that character has to say. I thought he was flogging financial advice now, isn't he?
I'm not sure on his inner.
And he must have got a gig on one of those weird new TV channels, surely. Anyway, carry on. So Farage is threatening to come back again and lose to another dolphin.
He's giving those general positive sort of messages that he might be doing that. And a recent poll actually said that 26% of voters, I think it was, or 28% of voters would either be very interested or quite interested in voting for a party led by Nigel Farage.
Is that a poll of Daily Express readers by any chance?
I don't think it was, but it came out on the Telegraph. I don't know whether it's actually one of their polls or whether it's from another poll, but I was basically listening to the News Agents podcast and what's the other one? The Rest is Politics, and both of them were talking about this.
So why is Starmer's move defined by that or relevant to that?
Over the next 2 years, things are obviously going to be really, really bad in the UK, and we are going to need more immigration. If Starmer comes out and says that I'm not going to be the immigration guy, we're not going to have that under me, and the Tories are forced into a corner where they have to keep doing that. That's why they ran that flag up about the Swiss-style arrangement between the UK and the EU. It's what Alistair Campbell called running a flag, where you just put a newspaper article out, you drop it and see how it goes down. And he thinks that they're probably going to try and do that again a little bit later because of how bad things get. So the more you do that, the more you agitate the right. And the reality is that if there is this right-wing party led by Nigel Farage, and even half of the people who say they might vote for him do, it will take huge numbers away from Tory voting, where our first-past-the-post system will mean they will go from maybe securing 100 total seats to securing like 50 in the worst case scenario.
I don't understand. Sorry. I understand the words you've said, and I found the poll. 12% of the public would be very interested in backing a new Farage venture, which is about what UKIP was getting in its pomp, isn't it? And another 16 would be quite interested. So, and someone else has just pointed out, it was flogging gin not long ago, as Jeff in...
of course he was.
The opposite would be true, wouldn't it? Is that if the Tories and UKIP are going to start fighting over racist votes again, then Labour just benefits from that. It makes a mockery of the idea that Labour need to start going after the anti-foreigner votes as well.
Yeah, of course. So that's the point. The Tories will lose votes from that, but Labour are insulating themselves against it because they're the ones not in power, not actually allowing people in.
Insulating themselves against what?
The loss of people who don't want immigration from their voting.
Right. So there's three anti-immigration parties fighting for the anti-immigration vote then?
Well, no, because there's...
Or the Tories have been boxed into the corner of not being able to be anti-immigration enough.
Exactly.
So Starmer's moving into that territory.
Exactly. Because he can put his hands up and say, if we were in power, we wouldn't be doing this.
Yeah.
And the people that are actually going to be sucked out, because there are obviously a lot more anti-immigration votes in the Tory party, they're the people that are going to be sucked out towards voting.
Yeah, again, I see that as being a reason why Starmer should have the courage of his convictions. If we get another even further to the right party than the current Tory party, which I mean, is going to be pretty close to a fascist party by any sort of reasonable measure, then why would Starmer be chasing the same lunch? Why would he be going after the same people?
Oh, I agree that he shouldn't be. I don't think that. I don't actually want that.
Well, then, with love and respect, don't come on the show and offer up other people's theories, because then when I've properly examined them, you can turn around and say, oh, no, I don't think that at all. I've just wasted 8 minutes of your life pretending that I do.
No, I mean, I think that's what he's doing. I don't think it's the right choice,
right?
But I think that's what
he's
doing.
Going after the. He's going after the. Yeah, but the reason why he's doing it doesn't make any sense to me.
Well, because if he can put himself in that position, if he can say that he's the party of no immigration.
Yeah, no, I think I prefer the original analysis, which is that he is simply insulating himself from the "Get Brexit Undone" accusation or the "Keep Brexit Done" sloganing. He's not going after people who despise freedom of movement. He's going after people who would be agitated by any suggestion that we were going to undo Brexit, because they're not ready to admit that they made a terrible mistake yet, even though they might be ready to undo some of the damage once they've got a different Prime Minister. But I don't know. We shall see. 2 very, very excellent podcasts, by the way. The Rest is Politics with Alistair Campbell and Rory Stewart, and, of course, our very own, The Newsagents with John Sopel, Emily Maitlis and Lewis Goodall. It's 11 o'clock. 4 minutes after 11, and we are going in. I don't remember the last time we had a private education debate on this programme. Do you? It seemed to sort of drop off the political radar. When I were a lad, and I was at a very prestigious public school. Do you want to know how, something funny, when you present a radio phone-in show, you get quite an early indication of how Twitter works. So if I mention that I went to public school, I will get 50 messages. Oh, why do you always mention that you went to public school? If I don't mention that I went to public school, I will get 50 messages that go, oh, why aren't you mentioning that you went to public school? So I did that, probably why some of us find the absolute craziness of Twitter a little bit easier to deal with than others do. If you've had the luck of doing a job like this for 10 years before Twitter kicked in, then the what you might call the clash of idiots' corners becomes less discombobulating, less troubling. So I mention it whenever we're discussing issues of privilege, which is almost all issues, and especially when we're discussing issues of education, because I think it's important. I can't expect you to be completely honest with me if I'm not completely honest with you. So, I mean, equally, by the same token, as you will know, if you've heard us address this subject before, or indeed if you've read my last book, How Not to Be Wrong, The Art of Changing Your Mind, you'll know that I concluded when our kids became of a relevant age that my dad, my late father, would haunt me if I didn't prioritise their education above everything else in life, just as he did for me. But that doesn't mean I can defend private education, I'm afraid. If you think it does, it doesn't. It is one of those things that if it exists, then I'm not going to let your kids have it if mine can't. I don't know whether that's selfish or hypocritical or both or neither. But there's no earthly way I'm going to let Jacob Rees-Mogg send his kids to the best schools in the country and not move heaven and earth to send mine as well. This is something my dad taught me. I didn't realise at the time that this is what he was teaching me. In fact, I didn't fully appreciate what he did and what his motivation was until after he died. But my dad was a brilliant journalist, one of the very best of his generation. He cut his teeth in the north of England, covering everything from the docks in Hull and sundry other industrial infrastructures that are no longer with us, and then latterly Longbridge, the car industry in the Midlands, the mining strike in across the north of England and Wales, and he didn't go as far in journalism as he should have done. This is my belief. We never had this conversation. He was made redundant by the Daily Telegraph in my final year at public school, which again I only realised after he had passed away, meant that Mum and Dad never got the benefit of that money that they were spending on my education. They didn't even get 5 years of not having to find the money to pay my school fees on the back of a decent Daily Telegraph salary. But I'll tell you something for nothing. No earthly way a Daily Telegraph journalist now, at the level my father reached, would be able to send their children to the sort of school I went to. You're looking at £30,000 a year school fees now. And you'd be on about 100 grand a year now for that kind of job. Maybe a little bit more, maybe a little bit less. So by the time you've paid tax, the idea that you'd have 30 grand left over to send one child to that sort of school would clearly be ridiculous. And I think that might be relevant because my defence would always have been in 2 or 3 phases. Phase 1, you've just heard. But that's about why you shouldn't abolish private. That's why you should be able to go to private schools. It's why you're not calling for the abolition, or if you are calling for the abolition, you're still prepared to send your own children there until they're abolished. So that's a different argument. The defence of not charging more money, not putting VAT on school fees, breaks down for me in one of 2 or 3 ways. The first way it breaks down is that argument, is if you increase the fees by 20%, then the parents like mine will no longer be able to send their children there. Well, my parents wouldn't be able to send me there anyway now because the fees have increased and the average wages have not. So let's have a look at how many people would be in that category today. What proportion of privately educating parents are making enormous sacrifices to do it? And also, so what? Some parents are making enormous sacrifices to feed their children. The idea that we should be giving thousands of pounds a year in tax relief to parents making, quotes, enormous sacrifices, end quotes, to privately educate their children is, when you think about it, a little hard to sustain. But it's on the front page of the Daily Mail today, which means that you are now being rather strenuously encouraged not to think about it. That's the trick. You'll probably start hearing phrases like politics of envy soon, or motivated by jealousy. Quite the opposite. The idea that we made enormous sacrifices. And my parents did make sacrifices, but they sacrificed things like foreign holidays and fancy cars, or a bigger house, or new carpets. They didn't sacrifice dinner in order that me and my sister could eat. And we've spoken to parents on this programme who are doing that right now in modern Britain. So I don't buy that. And also, they worked so hard. I don't buy that either. I'm an appalling poster boy for public school education, actually, because the idea that my parents worked harder than yours did and yours never had a hope in hell of sending you to a school like mine is obviously ridiculous. Obviously ridiculous. I know what you're thinking. You're saying, James, you're going to offer up some defences of the system. And all you're doing is pulling it to pieces. Yeah, okay, so here's the defence, such as it is. It actually breaks down class divisions. As long as it exists, then it means that people can buy a place in the 1%, all right? Or actually, the percentage of school children in the UK that are privately educated currently stands, I think, at 5.8%. And if you were to break that down, because a lot of these schools now have a large proportion of foreign students, so they would count as being school children in the UK, but they would not count as being British school children. So if you could find, and if someone could find this for me, I'd be very grateful. I've had a look, but I failed, and I'm live on the radio, so I can't really multitask. The percentage of, or the proportion of British school children who are privately educated, if my calculations are correct, it's going to be lower than 5.8%. So who exactly are we giving this money to? Or rather, who exactly are we giving this tax break to? An absolutely tiny proportion of parents who privately educate their children. And I think it's indefensible. Even though I haven't done the sums yet, and luckily my kids are getting older as we speak, but even though I may well fall into the category of parents who would not be able to sustain the increased cost of private education if this were to be brought in. When I say we're going to pay for kids to catch up at school, I also say it will be funded by removing private schools' charitable status. So we're not calling for the abolition of private education, which was a live political issue when I was young. I remember sitting in politics classes at my school with Shirley Williams' nephew at a time when Shirley Williams was very much a campaigner for the abolition of the sort of school that we were at. There's no hypocrisy. That was her nephew, not a son or daughter, but it just always struck me as quite amusing. He's a lovely lad, actually. I mean, that ship has sailed. Most other countries don't have anything like our system. It's an entrenched system designed to create people who could run the empire. And it has sustained for reasons of snobbery, privilege and access. The best way I can explain it to you is using my dad's logic, it's a golden ticket. It is a golden ticket that allows you to reach places that you may not have reached without it. Deep, 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 deep down, I would love to believe that I would have enjoyed whatever success I've enjoyed in my career, even if I'd gone to the local comprehensive school in Kidderminster. But I'm not arrogant enough to believe that. I do believe that the education I received, although it was somewhat abruptly curtailed, much against my wishes, I do believe that the education I received, the contacts I made, the language I learned to speak, I do believe it played quite a big role in my career. For good or for ill. It also did me quite a lot of harm in other ways, which thankfully therapists exist to address and fix. But my dad thought, because of his own experiences and his own life, my mum and dad thought that private education provided a golden ticket for their children, and they elected to buy me one, right? And it worked. Think of it like a swipe card. It got me through doors I wouldn't have known existed if I had come up through a different educational system. See, mum and dad were not from that background, so they couldn't have talked me through these doors. They couldn't have told me how to walk the walk and talk the talk, not from an insider's perspective. And if you increase the cost of these schools, then the number of children getting golden tickets who don't already have them, i.e. they haven't been born into these social classes, they haven't been born... Should we call it the ruling class? Should we just call it that? I think we should. So you haven't been born into the ruling class, but you can buy a golden ticket and get close to it. The number of children able to do that will diminish. But when I look at the numbers, if you're looking at... I look at the numbers. I look at 5.8% of school children in the UK, which I do think, until someone corrects me, I think you can shave a significant fraction off that when you confine it to British school children in the UK being privately educated. How can anybody in good faith argue that you should be getting a tax break on your school fees when you can't even get a tax break on a bag of chips? You pay VAT on a bag of chips if you eat in. Have I got that right? You pay VAT on a car, you pay VAT on almost everything you buy. But you don't pay VAT on a golden ticket? How can that be? The thing that you're buying for your children so that they can reach places where other children can't reach? You know that line I use about people who were born 3-0 up and think that they scored a hat-trick? I'm the opposite of that. I'm pretty confident, and most of my friends from school are as well, that what we got gave us wings, like Red Bull. It really did. And so how can that not be subject to VAT when an iPhone is? That's the conversation I'd like to have with you. I don't want it to get messy. It's an important political intervention. I don't know how big a deal it makes, and that means that it is one of those little policies that probably has more politics than policy attached to it. This is more about the expression of equality, perhaps, than it is about the difference it would actually make. Because then you've got the problems. If you want to get into the granular detail of it, we'd have to make a rough estimate of how many children would come out of the private system almost immediately. It happened quite a bit during the pandemic, actually. We've got friends who could no longer sustain school fees during the pandemic, and that means that there is a potential influx into the state system. Remember that if you're privately educating your children, you're also paying through income tax for the state education system. So you have that problem, but I don't think personally that it would be huge, that the numbers might be there if you want them. 0345 6060973. So that would be one problem. I can't think of many others. They're the two issues I've got for you. Number one, fewer children not born into the ruling class would be able to get a golden ticket. Even fewer. So you would perhaps have a deeper entrenchment of that level of privilege and inequality. And number two, the kids whose parents could no longer pay the fees would flood into an already overburdened state system. That's what you've got. 0345 6060 973. I don't know whether private tutoring is subject to VAT, actually, as Vicky's just asked me. It's a great question and relevant to this conversation, although it's not going to change the nature of it. 0345 6060 973. I'd like you to defend the idea that school fees that currently benefit 5.8% of UK school children should not be subject to VAT. Why shouldn't they be? When you pay VAT on an iPhone or on dinner out, why shouldn't you pay it on a golden ticket? It's a value-added tax, and few things provide more value for money, in my opinion, than a private education. It's 11:18. It is 21 minutes after 11. They've come up with 90,000. I'm struggling to work out where this figure has come from. Jeremy Hunt has said that it could cause 90,000 pupils to switch to the state sector. That's a pretty weak argument against doing it, isn't it? Yeah, I mean, yes, the state sector is overburdened and suffering in all sorts of ways after 12 years of Tory rule. But the idea that because 90,000 new pupils would put even more strain on it, then we should leave those 90,000 new pupils where they are, just make the state sector better. And in fact, the likelihood of making the state sector better surely increases the more that politicians are likely to send their own children there. Maybe. Maria's in Clapham. Maria, what would you like to say?
Hi, James.
Hello.
Yeah. I'm defending the charitable status from the point of view of a parent that you describe, such as your parents.
Yes.
Somebody who's making huge sacrifices, no holidays, not even a car, actually.
Yes, but I need to remind you that there are people listening to this who didn't have dinner last night so their children could eat. So sacrifices, the word huge is relative.
Yes, okay. I agree, sacrifice is a tricky word, but one doesn't exclude the other, as in, as a shorthand, my political views are very similar to yours. I'm not saying that to sort of,
No, of course.
I'm just saying that as a shorthand to sort of what I believe. So I absolutely believe we're not doing enough for helping the working people and the least well-off in the society. But it depends how you design your sort of social mobility. So I feel everybody should have a chance at it. And, for example, I volunteer for a charity that tries to get kids from low social mobility areas into university.
Yeah.
And I'm very proud of the kids that I mentor, and actually one of them has got an interview at Oxford soon. So I'm doing all of that, and I think everybody should have a chance. Sorry, I'm a bit nervous.
Don't be, and I know you're nervous, and that's why I'm holding fire.
Thank you. Thank you.
But not permanently.
No, all I'm saying is that if we believe in social mobility, there will be different levels of it. Yes, absolutely, we need to do more to help the least well-off in the society. But I'm just saying, if you believe in social mobility, there will be different levels of it, and I think we should help at each level, the same way that I'm just helping my mentee get into Oxford, and she's from a council estate in London.
And I mean, one can only applaud that. The problem is, as I think perhaps you already realise, even subconsciously, is that if you believe in doing more to help the least advantaged, then and you truly believe in social mobility, it's pretty hard not also to approve of doing less to help the most advantaged.
Yes, but the most advantaged, the one, as you say, this is a golden ticket into the 1%, which means by description you're not the 1%.
No.
So you're not helping. The most advantaged are going to be just fine. I mean, this is not going to make that much difference.
No, I agree.
It's the ones who are trying to buy the golden ticket. Whether it's right or wrong, I mean, look, I grew up in Germany. I know what you mean. If I was in Germany, probably my kid would be in a state school. But I'm not. I'm here, and the system is different. And within this system, I think it's right is maybe too strong a word, but it's okay to want to buy the golden ticket within this system.
It is, but we're not talking about that. We're talking about whether it's okay to get a tax break on it, whether it's okay not to pay VAT on that when if the parents who are struggling even to feed their children have to pay VAT on almost everything that they buy. They pay VAT on the fuel that they need to do their job. They pay VAT on the clothes that they wear. They pay VAT on television that they watch in the evening. I just don't see. I don't think you do either deep down. But we're very similar. Is that I don't want it to be quite as glaring, and that is the only line we've got, Maria. If we're really, really honest, the only line we've got is that pricing more people out of this entrenches the privilege of the people who aren't priced out of it.
I think that's one argument.
I think it's the only argument, personally.
Well, on the taxes, I sort of don't want to get deep into that argument, but you could argue that we're paying tax already because, we are paying the same taxes as everybody else.
Yeah, but so are people with no children.
Well, this is true, and to be honest, I have heard people with no children complain about that as well.
Yeah. So you can't. I don't think this is winnable in that sense. I think it's a question of the best I've got. If the system exists, then I'll do everything I can to take advantage of it. And I know it's an unfair system, but I'm not going to sacrifice my children's education upon the altar of my own woolly undergraduate politics.
Exactly. No, exactly. But I think that this is also a wrong battle to have. I think.
That's why he's doing it. I think. Do you know why I think he's doing it? And again, we're back. I don't know if you heard the first hour. This ruthlessness that I never really thought he had. He's demonstrated it on the freedom of movement issue, and on this, I think he's throwing red meat to the hard left.
I think he is as well, and I think it's just a wrong battle to have. And also, don't forget, James, that yes, maybe a proportion of children in private school with parents such as myself is low, but he will also alienate the sort of the soft left. There is a lot of sort of middle classish sort of center left.
There's only 600,000 children in private education in entirety. The numbers are tiny. I don't think they're electorally significant.
What do you think about the sort of middle class voter who is sort of center left and doesn't necessarily have kids in private school? Will they like this battle, even if their kids are not?
Well, we'll find. Hey, hang on, we can find out. I've got a phone in. I was about to try and answer your question from a position of absolutely no insight or knowledge whatsoever. We can try and find out. Centre left. There, you've heard it. I'm struggling to free up phone lines at the moment, but Maria and I are about to say goodbye. So if you are centre left, not privately educating your children, how do you feel about this? I think you're going to like it. Maria, I don't want to misrepresent you. You think they're not going to like it. Am I right?
Yes, I think the swing voter or the centre-left voter will not like it.
Who's not privately educated. Let's have a look. 0345 606 0973. Maria, thank you. And that was a brilliant debut. It's a tricky subject, this. I should have. Crikey, talk about self-referential. I was about to say, I wish I'd brought my book into the studio this morning so I could remember what I wrote about the issue, but I essentially wrote what I just said to Maria. It's an unfair system, but if your kids are going to benefit from an unfair system, I'm not going to sit on my hands or put handcuffs on my kids. And I know that is perpetuating the unfair system. Get rid of the unfair system, and I'll applaud you to the rafters. If the unfair system is still there, I'm in. I'm afraid. It's like, well, if I can afford it. 29 minutes after 11, and Maria's point, the most powerful point she made, is that this will reduce the number of people who can afford it, which means that those. And also there's that line that they're all using already, saying, well, it will just be confined to foreigners. Well, if you don't like the fact that our private schools are going to be full of foreign children, then don't let them come here. It's you've abolished freedom of movement of workers. Why not abolish freedom of movement of students? Because the schools would shut and your kids wouldn't be able to go to them either. 11:30 is the time. Holly Harris is here with your headlines. 11:34 is the time. In Finland, writes Keith, he's 50 this year, he tells us. We're still looking for the youngest Keith in the country. What's the current record, Keith? Where were we? Do we have a 36-year-old? 36, 38? Well, no, that's you. They've got to be younger than you to qualify. I grew up in... Keith says, there are no private schools in Finland. Wealthy parents ensure their children's state schools are good, thus benefiting all. Aye. I grew up in Ireland. I'm not privately educated, but I am fortunate enough to have built a good business, and I count myself very blessed. Children deserve as much help as possible to achieve and grow in society, and I think private education is very important for this. Surely adding VAT to school fees will mean fewer parents that are already borderline can afford to send their children to these schools. This in turn will mean fewer doctors, dentists, and other professionals that we so desperately need. How can this be a good choice? I'm just reading them out. I can think of some answers to the questions that you posed in an almost rhetorical fashion, but when you say kids deserve as much help as possible to achieve and grow in society, it's a little odd that you're talking about the 5.8% of kids, and thank you for the kind words about the programme, who've already got enormous advantages. Lorraine's in Whitehaven. Lorraine, what would you like to say?
Good morning, James.
Hello, Lorraine.
I've listened very carefully to the debate this morning. I'm a former deputy head teacher in the state school system.
Oh, yeah.
Worked all of my life in the state school system. I fully agree with Starmer's policy of removing the tax breaks from private schools. The clue is in the word, private. They are private institutions, and people have every right to send their children and use their money to these institutions. But to dress them up as charities and to justify their existence of the tax break by saying, well, we do help students in the state school system, to me, that is the essence of why it is so wrong, because state school students should not be beholden in a system to the crumbs off the table of those who have the money to send their children to these schools. There's also another issue, that there is a basic underlying assumption that the private school system is better.
Yes, you're right.
They do have better facilities, you can't deny that. But in my many years' experience, the children that we produce in the state system are better rounded individuals, no disrespect to those who've been to private school, but their daily experience of life and the range of people that they come into contact with, I would argue, is far broader than those who go to the private school system, who tend to be within a particular class of people.
Yes, you can't. I don't think you need to argue that. I think that's just counting. But I don't know that it necessarily makes them more rounded. I think it probably does, but you're getting a causation from a correlation. Obviously, the more diverse your experience is, the more equable your worldview is likely to be. But it's not guaranteed, is it?
It isn't guaranteed on either side. But the other thing that is really inherently wrong is that if you look at the number of people in Parliament who go on to make education policy that affects the majority of our children in this country, the people who are making the education policy are people who haven't experienced the state school system.
And how significant do you think that is? How important do you think that is?
Very significant. For example, if you look at education ministers, past education ministers, who have argued and set class ratios, teacher-student ratios at 32 to 1 is acceptable. 30 to 1 is acceptable.
And you had 4 people in your Latin class.
Exactly. And
it's
so,
tricky, that.
Whichever way you look at it, James, it is the charitable status and the tax break. They've just got to go. If people want to send their children to these schools, please do so. You know, nobody's going to stop you. You can't stop private schools.
Oddly, you are going to stop, or Keir Starmer is going to stop some people sending their children to these sort of schools by bringing in this policy. But, of course, that's based on income, and income already stops the huge majority of the country.
Well, exactly.
So we're just increasing that.
It's a luxury that most people, let's face it, most people in this country sending their children to a private school is a luxury, and they may work very hard for that luxury.
We've covered that. You're right. And so some of the language is unhelpful because it almost implies that other people don't work hard or that other people aren't making sacrifices.
You don't want the best education for your children. Well, I've worked in the state school system all my life, and I can, hand on heart say the majority of children that come through our classroom doors have parents who want nothing but the best for their children.
You're a brilliant caller, Lorraine. I'm glad you were listening, and thank you for taking the time to call in. Because the 2 things I'd like your help with next. The first is, what about the influx argument? What about all of that? I don't know where this 90,000 figure came from, but
that's not a great deal, really. 90,000, and maybe if those students did go back into the state sector and a few more, then maybe there would be a bigger push.
You'd have some more sharp-elbowed parents possibly pulling everybody along with them because they would demand, well, we must have a rugby team or we must have a language laboratory and I'll raise the money. I don't know. I'm just cliche.
Or we must have smaller class sizes.
Yes.
Which is critical, really.
Yes. And the final point, my defence on this, which is that it would deny the golden ticket to even more people. So it's almost like flipping the last argument on its head and saying, yes, it's an unfair system, but the more people not born into privilege who can access privilege through parental intervention, surely the better. Otherwise, the only people who are going to be availing themselves of this privilege are the people who've got all the privileges already.
Well, no, because, the word privilege in itself, we shouldn't be aspiring to have privilege. We should be aspiring to have fairness. And education opens doors and gives everybody a fair crack at the whip. If you can get a decent education, a decent set of qualification and a decent set of life skills, then you can live a fulfilled and happy and productive life.
And you're quite right to
nothing to do with privilege, really.
I know, you're right. This is my brainwashing. This is my brainwashing kicking in, because I balked then when you said that, and I was getting ready to bite back, but thankfully I didn't. I stayed quiet and I listened, and of course you cast privilege as being a synonym for an unfairness, don't you? Which it is.
It is. It should be equitable. And yes, that's an ideal, but when I went into the education sector, that's what I believed I was doing. I was helping students to have privilege through education.
Oh, yeah.
Privilege through learning, privilege through experiences, not through money.
And you can't really aspire to that dreadful phrase, level up, when you're perpetuating this bizarre pyramid peak. Why do so many parents think, and so many beneficiaries of private education, balk at the description of it as being unfair?
I think it's because it's a difficult thing to confront, that money is at the heart of a lot of people's existence, and that, how people use their money. I just happen to think that healthcare and education should be two areas of our lives where money should not be the determining factor. I'm the daughter of a coal miner, grew up in the 70s, first person went to university. I went through a system where university education was free. If I was going through the system now, my parents wouldn't have sent me to university. They wouldn't have been able to afford it. And I've lost count now of the number of really good students who should have gone on to become doctors, lawyers, all the so-called aspirational professions that people look up to, and they don't anymore because of the debt that they're going to incur since fees were introduced. And it's a whole raft of issues that are...
Why then, I'm sorry, you probably weren't expecting to stay on for this long, but you're such a powerful contributor to this. I need to ask you the final question, is that why then are you comfortable with their existence at all? Why aren't you calling for them to be abolished?
Because I'm a realist.
Yeah. Okay, so be an idealist for a minute.
Yeah. If I was an idealist, I would say that, as in other countries, everybody should go to the state school system. It works well in other countries.
And it can only improve, can't it? In that
exactly. But in this country, the class systems, the private school system are so entrenched, the political system, it would be, I would think, certainly not in my lifetime, it would be impossible to disentangle.
It would be like trying to get the eggs out of a baked cake, Lorraine.
It would be.
Which is something we've discovered in recent years is not as easy as some people like to think it is. Thank you, Lorraine. That was really helpful for me, and probably a timely reminder that the hypocrisy is undeniable, albeit that you seek to mitigate some of its sharper edges with these arguments. They don't stand up to scrutiny. And in fact, here's another one. The golden ticket, this is unsigned, is now a diamond-encrusted platinum ticket that so few people can afford, despite the tax break, that any increase in cost will impact so very, very few people as to be socially irrelevant. Now, I agree with that, which is why I think it's quite cynical politics from Keir Starmer. I don't think it's going to make much of a difference to anybody. Even if this figure of 90,000 turns out to be true. What's 90,000 people in a population of 60 million? Nothing. Buttons. I don't think it probably would be that high. And when you factor in the number of the children in these private schools who are from overseas already, the impact it would have on British families and British children is probably relatively negligible. So why is he doing it? Yeah. Interesting, isn't it? Why is he doing it? Because it is a beloved principle of traditionally left-wing people. And there's nothing wrong with that, although Claire is unhappy with this. Starmer is not appealing to the hard left. I shouldn't have said hard left. I apologise. Starmer is not appealing to the hard left by removing the charitable status. He's simply righting a long-term injustice. And she adds, as an expression of her frustration at my treatment of this subject. Get some callers on who use the state school system, please. That came in before Lorraine, the former deputy head of a state school. Set us straight on so many things. So that it's the charitable status that is the injustice, not the ability to pay for an education. And that's a really helpful distinction that I possibly missed at the top of this hour. It's 11 minutes to 12. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where we are having a nuanced and interesting conversation about private education, and specifically Keir Starmer's pledge to abolish the charitable status of private schools, which is being defended by the Daily Mail on the grounds that, well, I get it absolutely right, because it's a fairly straightforward defence. The homegrown middle classes would be squeezed out. The very rich would be able to afford it. Many private schools already have a large contingent of students whose parents are wealthy foreigners. There will be still more of them if the homegrown middle classes are squeezed out. So we shouldn't remove the charitable status of private schools because the beneficiaries, the tiny number of beneficiaries of an obviously unfair system would become even tinier. And I speak as a subscriber to that system, a beneficiary of that system, and indeed a subscriber to it. I recognise that I almost want the decision to be taken away from future generations of parents. But as Lorraine said, I'm a realist, not an idealist. Abolition is unlikely to come about, but making it ever more rarefied, making the numbers ever smaller. I'm sure when I was a kid it was close to double figures, and now it's down to 5.8%. So who knows? And fair play to Gary for pointing out a missed trick when I was talking to Lorraine and used one of my favourite phrases to describe the idea of abolishing private education, getting rid of all private schools would be like trying to get the eggs out of a baked cake, Lorraine. When, as Gary has very cleverly pointed out, what I should have said, of course, is it would be like trying to get the eggs out of a quiche. Lorraine. Ruby's in Wandsworth. Ruby, what would you like to say?
I'm quite conflicted about this, and it's quite a niche kind of experience, I guess, that I'm going to try and explain.
Go on.
So I grew up I was at primary school in the 70s, and it was a state school. We were a very low-income household, and we had some friends up the road whose daughters were a bit older than us, and at that time, you either do GCSEs or CSEs, and if you did CSEs, you wouldn't go to university. I think that changed, but at that time. So anyway, to cut a long story short, it was going to be state education because we couldn't afford it, but the experience of our friends was that actually their kids, and we are from ethnic minorities, so we're not white,
right.
Were put into CSE classes, and you know, the drive are a lot of immigrants that come. It's the education, you want to get on in life.
Yes.
And so they found out, my parents found out, with the help actually of the primary school teacher, about assisted places. So I went into private education, went to university, and incidentally, the girls who were ahead of me, they became academics in places like Cambridge and Harvard.
Gosh.
But might not have been. So that's a really powerful kind of experience. But then when I had my kids, I thought things must have changed. They went to the local state primary school. And actually what I found was that it's really, people might not understand this, but
don't worry, take your time.
We're middle class, non-white people. And I found that in the school, and we come from a fairly middle-class kind of area, so the state school is full of, you know, relative affluence compared to some other parts of the country. So my kids, who are quite bright, were not in the top sets in the classes. And I could sense that they weren't perhaps having the same experience as their peers. And so we decided, actually, we'd probably go then for private education, and we put them in through, they have to do the entrance exams. And my kids actually scored much higher because they ended up being invited for things like scholarships compared to their peer group, and the peer group were in the top set who were white and we weren't. And so it kind of made it.
So you think their ethnicity was you think there was racism in place in the state school?
I do. I think,
because there's a hell of a lot of racism in private schools as well.
I know. So that's what I want to go on to, because my kids are now coming towards the end of their private education. I think what people found difficult, because they're very good with people who have first-generation parents, but they found us, I don't know, it was a really awkward experience, and I don't know why that is, but almost I was always feeling as though they assumed I was a pushy parent.
Right.
And I don't think I
see what you mean, yes.
Yeah, and so I just wanted, and all my friends, or kids' friends, were actually white, because again, it's that whole middle class thing. You can't help it. The play dates, what you do in leisure, you end up mixing in the same kind of outside of school. But so we then chose schools that were actually very mixed ethnically, because that was really important. We looked at also the amount of people that were on bursaries, and so they went to private education, and they're doing very well. And so it's tricky, because we're doing effectively between two of us 3 jobs in order to keep them there.
Yes. No, I know, but I've excluded that argument from the conversation today, because there are people listening doing 2 or 3 jobs just to keep their heads above water. So briefly, if you would, on the specific question of this 20%, this loss of, so don't think about it as the money, Ruby, because that's the question you're answering. Think about it as the charitable status. Should these schools have charitable status in a country where we're now opening warm banks?
Yes. So what I feel is I would love to have sent my kids to the local state secondary school, because they're good schools, and the kids, they're going to
have to hurry you slightly.
Yeah. And so so that's what I would like. And so I'm quite, I think.
But should the private schools have charitable status?
Well, I think the schools, I can only speak about the 2 that we've chosen.
No, you can't. You've got to speak about all of them.
No, from my personal experience.
Well, I'm not after your personal experience. I'm after your political opinion. Should private schools have charitable
there is a lot of charitable work that goes on, and there's a lot of...
but there'd be a hell of a lot more good being done if every school fee bill in the country had a 20% surcharge on it. It would go directly towards improving state schools.
Yes, but what I'm trying to say is that I think that's right, and I've always voted Labour, and I knew that.
Would this put you off? Will this put you off voting?
No, it won't. But I'm just saying that I think that people don't understand that it is people's circumstances.
Of course,
are all different, and
I think they do. I think they do understand that, but I think people like you and I, and Maria earlier, possibly try to convince ourselves that it's not quite as black and white as it probably is in the ultimate scheme of things. But at least we're not in that dreadful category of people who pay for the unfair advantage and deny that it's an unfair advantage, which is a remarkable situation to be in. Although I appreciate that there are elements of your family and indeed your story that I'm not going to be able to share because of our different backgrounds. It's coming up to 11:58. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Stacey's in Acton with what will probably be the last word on this. What would you like to say, Stacey?
Hi,
Hello.
I'm calling today in regards to what we're discussing about. I don't think it should be going up. We're just about making ends meet. And we've just started our daughter in a private education, taking her out of the state school because of many, many problems that we've had with the state school. And with them not being able to make things better for my daughter. My daughter's had to go through therapy at the state school. She's had to, take private lessons like tutoring and things like that, which has had to pay.
And if it went up by 20%, it would be out of your reach, would it?
Yes, 100%. I mean, our total household income is around 50,000.
Gosh.
Yeah.
So you're paying a third of it now on school fees, are you?
The school costs about 13,000 a year.
Yeah, so just under a third. That's 50 grand after taxes. Well, I don't need to know the details. And you're a perfect example of why this is as personal as it is political, because the system benefits you and you can just about afford it, but it doesn't mean the system is fair.
Yeah, that's right.
And the school can't really. I mean, it's a charitable status for a fee-paying school in a country where we're opening warm banks to look after people who can't afford to turn the heating on.
with the private education, with my daughter's confidence has improved immensely in just 3 months.
I know. I'm not disputing. I'm a huge appreciator of the advantages that it bestows, but I don't think when push comes to shove, either of us. And it's easier for me to say than you, because I could probably absorb. Well, I can absorb the extra cost without having to rethink our choices, whereas you wouldn't be able to. So now I'm patronising you. But I don't see how anyone can really argue that this organisation here that charges £13,000 or £40,000 for educating a child deserves charitable status in a country where they're opening warm banks for people who can't afford to turn the heating on. Maybe that's simplistic, I don't know, but thank you for that. What amazing calls. That's the most enjoyable radio phone-in about private education I've ever heard, and quite possibly in large part because nobody was boneheaded enough to use the phrase politics of envy. 4 minutes after 12 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. If you're listening in the first hour, here's a headline to an article published by encompasseurope.com, which I think is going to be very interesting. I haven't read it yet, but if you enjoyed that conversation about Brexit, Keir Starmer and the Labour Party and freedom of movement as much as I did, then you will probably find this headline as tantalising as I do. For the UK Labour Party, is Brexit a weapon to be utilised or a problem to be neutralised? Now, I think, actually, if you were listening in the first hour, the consensus was that it's a problem to be neutralised, even though in an ideal universe, people like me would want to see it as a weapon to be utilised. It's a problem to be neutralised. That's why he's doing what he's doing. We shall keep an eye on the on the story, keep an eye on developments, of course. Now, I hope this is the last time we ever talk about Matt Hancock on the programme, although this being LBC and the world being the world, I'd probably be handing over to him next time Sheila Fogarty goes on holiday. You never know. But it has been a really bizarre episode, hasn't it? And for my money, not a pleasant one, actually. I have to say. It was a caller last week who really brought home the shock and horror that some people were feeling at the sight of the man who was responsible for that lethal care homes policy, and then I think lied about it afterwards, behaving on television like a sort of Timmy Mallet tribute act. It's very, very strange. And then, of course, the fear that we again touched on last week, or the realisation, in fact, that we were witnessing a rehabilitation, that the plan was, in a sense, working. And then you never know how real these positions are on social media, but the idea that, it would be great if he wins because it upsets all the right people. I saw that a couple of times. And I thought, well, what, you mean grieving children? I appreciate that the Brexit Kool-Aid is still sticky for a lot of people, and you've got nothing to actually celebrate except the discomfort and unhappiness of people who understand things. But the idea that you would celebrate Matt Hancock winning I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here because it would really, really upset people who couldn't even attend their grandma's funeral or had to sit 2 meters away from their weeping mother at the burial of their dad. This is your constituency now? This is what you're after now? Upsetting people like that? Oh, no, I didn't mean them. I meant all the other ones. The ones that didn't actually lose anybody as a consequence or didn't suffer or struggle as a consequence of Matt Hancock's incompetence, but they have empathy for the people that did. They're the ones I really want to... Yeah. It'd be great if Matt Hancock won I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here, because all those people with empathy who make me feel weird and vampire-like, they're going to be really upset about it. It exists. It's such a driving force in British public discourse at the moment. The mind boggles. But he didn't win. Jill Scott won, the former England player, the legend, the Lioness. Crikey, she's had a good year, hasn't she? I mean, that goes pretty well. It's a mark of the imbalance between the men's game and the women's game. That if the men's team had won the Euros, I don't think any of them would have gone into the jungle because their earning potential and their status would have been so much higher than the Lionesses. I could be wrong about that, by the way. Don't at me. Just occurs to me that with male sportsmen, it's a bit later in the cycle. You'd be like Mike Tyndall, who won the World Cup 20 years ago. So what have we learnt from Matt Hancock going into the jungle? Here's the question I've got for you. I've just done a thing for Radio 4, actually, just as a contributor, about whether or not media training has had a deleterious effect on politics. You never know for sure when someone's been trained or not trained, but you do have a fair inkling if they start saying things like, let me be clear, and then doing the opposite. Cleverly's a really bad example of this. Cleverly says, let me finish, when no one's interrupting him. If you can say, let me finish 10 times in a 2-minute interview, then you've used up about 40% of the interview without actually having to answer any of the questions you've been asked. Or I'll ask you what you want for tea, and you start telling me what the weather's like, so I interrupt you, and you say, could you stop interrupting me? Could you just let me finish, please? It used to happen to me quite a lot. As I'd say, what do you want for tea? And you'd say, well, it's sunny out with a promise of shower. And so I'd interrupt. Otherwise, you'd carry on talking about the weather until we got to the end of the interview slot. So I said, I'm sorry, please, could you tell me what you want for tea? Well, you've just got to stop talking over people, James, and interrupting them. So politicians are very inauthentic these days. They have to be. I have some sympathy for them. The days when John Prescott could punch someone with relative impunity, although he got attacked by the right-wing media, the general consensus, I think, among honest people was that the bloke who he punched had it coming. I personally would seek to exercise rather greater self-control than John Prescott managed that day. But if someone threw an egg at my head, who knows whether or not I would be able to rein in a reflex reaction that felt or looked a lot like a punch. Who else? Alan Clark essentially listed all the women that he'd had adulterous affairs with in his diaries. I don't think we want to go that authentic, really. And he got treated like a legend for doing so by many on the right of the Family Values Brigade, on the right of British politics. Loved him. They lapped it up. So who do you think of when I say authentic politician? In latter years, you'd think of a Ken Clarke, wouldn't you, as opposed to a complete confection like Jacob Rees-Mogg, although actually largely as a consequence of the private school education system that we were talking about in the last hour, many people think that Jacob Rees-Mogg is a real character, a real person, rather than a sort of pantomime creation. So what purpose did it serve? Matt Hancock has said he went into the jungle because he wanted people to see what the real him was like. And David Aranovich of the Times asked a rather splendid question earlier this morning that I'm essentially just going to steal and repeat, when he said, why? Why would Matt Hancock think that the country needs to know what he's like as a person? And that's the question I've got for you. This idea of seeing that politicians are real people. A, is it a valid suggestion? Do you think we do need to see politicians as real people? And B, has Matt Hancock's adventure in the jungle been successful? Has it been in any way the glorious success that some of his allies and friends have painted it out? It's 11 minutes after 12. Let me have another crack at that. It's a slightly clumsy questioning. If I want to get the quality of calls that I demand on this programme, sometimes the quality of questioning needs to up its game slightly. So Hancock's explanation for why he did it was that he wanted the country to know what he's like as a person. I couldn't give two flying figs what Matt Hancock is like as a person, frankly. And if I was his constituent, I'd find the idea that he's gone into the jungle to show me what he's like as a person. How you display your real self by eating a hippopotamus's anus or something like that. The idea is absolutely ridiculous. It's a game show. He's playing a part. But is there something in that idea that the British public is so beleaguered? We've got such a low regard of politicians now that there is something almost attractive about seeing them in, what's the word I'm looking for? We're seeing them outside of a media-trained environment, all right? You can't, all the media training in the world is not going to influence the facility with which you consume a camel's appendage, which leads us neatly back to Friday's show when we had a slightly unfortunate experience with the dump button. 12 minutes after 12 is the time. So why did Matt Hancock do it, and did it work? But attendant to those two very straightforward and simple questions is there something bigger going on? Is there something a bit meta going on about the relationship between the public and politicians and the need that we have now to recognise that politicians are made of the same stuff that we are made of? There is a danger, I think, and I can't believe, I'm slightly cross, in fact, that Matt Hancock has become the vessel in which I carry this question. But there is a danger of thinking that they're not real. They have to be real. They are real people. Is there a deficit, a democratic deficit in the United Kingdom between the media-trained politician and the public? I don't know what example you'd use. You know what I always say at this point. It might be an apocryphal story, this, because I asked Jack Straw's son about it once, and he didn't know what I was talking about. But there was a story about Jack Straw when he was, I forget what he was actually, Home Secretary? Foreign Secretary, big job in government, and a new report came out that was very relevant to his brief. And he was on his way to the studios for the morning broadcast round, and he got someone to read him the article. And that meant that when he arrived in the studios and they said, "Have you read the article in the Times this morning?" he could say, "No, I'm afraid I haven't seen it," because he hadn't seen it. He'd had it read to him by somebody else. And that, to me, in many ways, seemed to be the essence of media training, when it still at least paid lip service to the truth, when the idea was still at least, I don't want to actually tell a blatant, bare-faced lie. I do a little bit of economical with the actuality. Do you see what I mean? Technically, I didn't lie, but everybody thinks you did, but technically you didn't because you hadn't read the article. That seems to me to be the entry level of the media training model. So has Matt Hancock... do you want to know why this introduction is a bit of a mess? Because I am fighting the thought that if I'd watched it, I'd have fallen for it. And then you have the attendant voice in your head going, well, you wouldn't have fallen for it at all. Maybe that's what he's really like. And that's why the two questions actually are the ones that I'm going to go with. I know he got paid 400 grand for it and the rest of it, but and that's a big part of the decision as well. But why did he do it? And did it work? Was it a success? Has he pulled it off? 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. I don't know what happens next. I don't know whether he gets a Michael Portillo type career. Michael Portillo was a particularly pungent politician back in the day. Younger listeners may not realise this, and he's sort of re-emerged as an avuncular travel show presenter in multicoloured tailoring, and he gets to go on the Orient Express and take fascinating train journeys, and he does a great job at it. I think he's a really good communicator. He comes across very well. Or Ed Balls, who went on Strictly Come Dancing and now pops up on Good Morning Britain and elsewhere. Is it going to work? Why did he do it? And did he pull it off? 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. The time now is 12:16. 19 minutes after 12 is the time. He came third. He was roundly pilloried when he went in. He was in charge of the National Health Service at a time of national crisis and didn't cover himself with glory. And he thinks that you somehow deserve an opportunity. Oh, he also did the holiday cover for that loudmouth idiot on LBC on the mid-morning slot. I didn't do a grand job at that, actually. But the question is, has he pulled it off? And that thing, I mean, this is the weirdest thing. And I've had a few messages telling me that you felt exactly the same way. I didn't watch it because I thought that I'd end up warming to him. Does that make me an idiot or him a fraud? Lee's in Worksop in Nottinghamshire. Lee, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. I think loudmouth idiot's a little bit harsh, but there you go.
You haven't met him.
No. I think the question of whether it's worked or whether he's pulled it off, I think only time will tell.
Yeah, true.
I think at the moment, as I was saying to your researcher, the problem is with especially politicians at the moment is even though they are leading the country, they see themselves as being superior and not on a level to us. And I think with social media, I was saying, like, when I was a kid, I mean, I'm 37. When I was a kid, the only way you found out about anything...
Still a kid.
The only way you found out about anything was in your magazine when you bought it on a monthly or weekly basis, in the newspaper or on the news. Now, anybody whether they're earning 200 grand a week or whoever they are, they can post anything on social media at any time. We don't see that from politicians. The only time we ever hear from or see politicians is when they're effectively scripted or telling lies.
Well, they are on social media a lot, although I appreciate what you mean, but much of what they write will be curated. Actually, I'll knit together the two topics, the last hour, the private education one, and this hour, because some politicians go on social media without any sense filter or without any wisdom filter on, and they end up being, I mean, what kind of authentic do you want? So I remember Nadine Dorries attacking me for being privately educated, and then it emerged 6 minutes later that she'd sent her daughters to exactly the same school that I went to. So I don't know that we want too much authenticity from politicians. What you describe, I think, is what my late father always referenced as, it's not you that's being invited to these parties, son, it's the name on your business card. So someone like Matt Hancock thinks that because he's touring the studios as a big shot Secretary of State, that's because he's Matt Hancock. They forget that it's because he's Secretary of State for Health. It's got nothing to do with him and everything to do with the job that he's got. They forget that, I think, a lot of them now.
Yeah. I think the idea now, especially for Matt Hancock, I think is, he went in there knowing that he's no longer going to be an MP, I think. And, he wants a new career. He wants to come away from Matt Hancock politician to Matt Hancock, whatever he's going to be, TV presenter, whatever. And I think that was the idea.
He's gone all in then. He's gone all in on a media career. 400 grand for his divorce settlement, Kate Robbins writes. He knows he'll have to give up an MP now. Starts a new TV career life as a fun, sartorially challenged presenter. The only trouble is, unlike Balls and Portillo, he is very dull. I mean, it's not an audition for being a charismatic media figure, just sort of, eating disgusting things on television. It's not. It's a bit like thinking that being a Generation Game contestant could make you a Generation Game presenter. So, did you watch much of it?
Yeah, I watched it all.
Did he pull it off? Did you like him more at the end than you did at the beginning?
I mean, don't get me wrong, he was brave with some of the things that he did, but, to say, did I like him? No.
What did he do that was brave?
Well, the challenges, I think he just sort of went all in. He didn't really sort of make a big deal of it. Well, the eating challenges and...
Well, that's not bravery.
Having his head in a cage full of water, full of it.
That's brave. That's a bit sort of like waterboarding. Although you're there, no one's ever been hurt, have they, on I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out? It's that weird, but that's a silly thing to say because people are terrified of all sorts of things without having a fully rational base. Maybe he wasn't terrified. I don't know. Toby's in Bristol. Toby, what would you like to say?
Hello, I was thinking about your Portillo statement, and I remember in '97 the pleasure I got in him losing his seat, and I was just thinking he's more like Neil Hamilton, in that he's this awful person with his wife, just traipsing around studios, becoming part of right-wing political parties. And I don't think
there was a period where you could they just popped up blooming everywhere, and they'd do anything. I mean, absolutely anything for a quid.
And he still does. I mean, he's now over in Wales, isn't he?
Is he?
The point I was trying to, I think.
God, haven't they suffered enough?
The point I was going to make was that Hancock is responsible for the policy that put 12,500 vulnerable people into care homes who died, and the Disability Rights website has now managed to establish that approximately nearly 40,000 additional deaths directly due to infections in care homes. And he's not the same. He's not just some sort of clumsy, dull politician who wants a media career, because that's clearly what he's aiming for. He's directly responsible through his policies, and his policies are right wing. He supported them, but he's tacitly supported right wing policies.
But do you not think is he not one of those politicians that would have been a communist if that's the way the wind was blowing?
Quite possibly. I think an awful lot of them are completely opportunist. I think an awful lot of the 2019 intake, plus the ones that have been around for the last 10 years, saw an opportunity and took it. I mean, that's how we ended up with Patel, Braverman and Raab. They were opportunists who saw a way of getting what they wanted, which was deregulating our country.
Some of them. I was reading an article about Braverman today in the New Statesman. It was very interesting. In 2015, you would have struggled to identify exactly what she stood for, but now she's a kind of textbook rabid right-wing ideologue. So has he pulled it off? I mean...
Not at all. I mean, like you, I didn't watch it at all. I was actually disgusted at ITV and approached him. My wife is a consultant medic.
Right.
And I had to push her out the door every morning during COVID with a mask on before there were vaccines, and she had to then go into work 5 days a week, full time, with no protection, and she was a vulnerable person due to medical issues from her past, and that was brave. And every day I was terrified that she was going to die.
That was brave.
And there he is doing these ridiculous activities purely because it's where he's been put, and he has to join in. It's like, going to a birthday party and joining in with the party games, but you have to because you're a good sport. And then he'll come out of it and think that he's done a jolly good job. And I think he's just the most, he's not the worst of them because he's a little bit more human.
Is he though?
But he's just as bad as them.
He caused suffering, and he wasn't honest about it. And he still hasn't. And he held Boris Johnson's pint for him, didn't he? While Boris Johnson was visiting all sorts of egregious behaviours upon the country. That gets glossed over a little bit.
He's looked at the way the wind, as you said, he's looked at the way the wind is blowing. They can see there's a catastrophe coming. And it's like, I'm going to jump ship before the whole thing crashes around me. And going back to what you were saying about Starmer earlier, I do think he's being pragmatic. I don't agree. I'm a passionate Remainer. I never think we should end up. And I stood 50 metres in front of him at the 2019 rallies in London and listened to him. But I know that it's not going to be easy, and I do think, as a lot of your callers said earlier, it's about that being pragmatic about how do we get these sort of pseudo-fascistic policies and people out of government, and we'll then see where we are. I'm a realist.
Why have you jumped to that? Why have you jumped from that just because you thought I'm on the radio now? I may as well get my money's worth.
Absolutely.
You weren't trying to draw a link between Matt Hancock and Keir Starmer at all.
Not especially. I think.
No, I was just checking. I thought I'd missed the link. I didn't realise you were just helping yourself to a contribution to the show that we were having 2 hours ago, Toby.
It's slightly more of a scatological approach to thinking.
No, that's absolutely scattergun. I think scattergun. I think you mean. I don't know. I'm not gonna risk finding out. Mary's in Nottingham. Mary, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. First-time caller. I'm
welcome.
Terrified. I feel like I'm on the Oblivion at Alton Towers.
Oh, well, that's a good ride, that. Not as good as the Cobra at West Midlands Safari Park, but that's not there anymore. Carry on.
True. I come from a very working-class family in the Midlands where all Labour supporters have been for all our lives. And in answer to your question, has he pulled it off? Absolutely. Because I went round to see my 87-year-old mum last night, who we didn't see for a whole year during the pandemic. We literally came to the door, dropped her shopping off, lady with lots of health problems. We were terrified we were going to lose her during that time, and thankfully we didn't. But her first comments to me last night were, have you seen Matt Hancock on I'm a Celebrity? And I launched into, it's disgraceful. And she stopped me right there and said, he's absolutely brilliant. He's done everything. He's been on every trial. You should have seen him. He's fantastic. Nothing was too awful for him. He's done brilliantly. And it was almost as if that whole persona of Matt Hancock, the MP, the person that was responsible for keeping us safe, for keeping our health workers safe, for keeping our elderly people safe, he sort of transformed into just this great sport who was willing to do everything and deserved a place in the final. And it really, I've never rang a radio show before, but it just took me by surprise that she could even think that and say that about this man. My husband and I, we've not watched one single episode out of obviously because of everything that happened. But it then sort of made me think, well, that's the Johnson-esque kind of politician these days.
Styling it out, just styling it out. And
exactly,
however low you are, you can soar again because forgive me, because of what is it on your grandma's part? Is it credulity, gullibility, or something less? I don't want to be too rude about her. She's your nan.
What is it? I just think that in some respects, she's just suspended that idea of who he was. It's gone. It's forgotten. It's in the past. He's now kind of this great sport, this new celebrity, this new interesting person. So I don't know whether that speaks for a lot of people in the country, whether they've just put it behind them and therefore it's acceptable. I mean, it must be because he's got so far in the competition.
Clearly
he's
some
not
people
being held to account.
No, it's an odd one, isn't it? And just, I think until we spoke last week to people who had lost loved ones, it was hard to fully appreciate the egregiousness of the whole thing, the offensiveness of it. But there it goes. There's nothing wrong with your grandma. She's been watching a game show. She's come away admiring one of the contestants on a game show. What is odd is that she's managed to detach him from the reason why he was well known enough to get on the game show in the first place. But what goes up could come down. Give it another month when the inquiry starts kicking in properly. When the inquiry actually delivers its results. All of the gloss that he's managed to apply to himself may be knocked off it again. Or it may not. He might end up presenting Top Gear. 12:31 is the time. Amelia Cox is here now with your headlines. 12:35 is the time. I don't do this really. We used to, but we don't really have the space to fill anymore. The politician you'd most like to see in the jungle. It's like genuinely the one that you think probably the least likely to turn up, but the one that you would most like to see do it. And there is part of the reason why this has been a rehabilitation for Matt Hancock, because you'll be partly thinking of the most awful politician that you can think of, the one you really don't like, and you'd think, oh yeah, stick him in there. And that's what they did. That was the calculation. It's a medieval stocks, And at some point, well, I guess there's two kinds of people that warmed to him. You've got people like our last caller's grandma, who just have the British underdog reflex, as I think Caitlin Moran called it last week in the Times. That British underdog reflex. He's taken so many rotten tomatoes straight to the kisser that you've just, much to your own surprise, ended up starting off with sympathy and from sympathy to warmth. Okay, it's a well-trodden path. Whether they deserve it or not, there's something about the process that engenders sympathy. There's a wrong un. Oh, he's exposing himself to all manner of abuses and enduring them without complaint. Perhaps he's not as bad as that after all. Oh, he's still exposing himself to all manner of abuses and enduring them without complaint. I'm beginning almost to admire his resolve. Oh, he's still exposing himself to all manner of abuses without complaint. I'm beginning to think they should stop exposing him to so many abuses now. I'm beginning to actually feel a little bit sorry for him. Oh, I seem to have moved from feeling a tiny bit sorry for him to quite liking him. So that's one part of the process. That's one group of people. Then you've got the other weird one, the ones who sort of love it because it's upsetting all the right people, or whatever the phrase du jour is. That's the Brexity bit. That's the one where I am a complete mess inside, and all I really derive pleasure from these days is other people's discomfort. And if they are people who seem to be generally quite happy, or generally quite fulfilled, or generally quite at one with themselves, then I'm going to love it when they're upset. That's all I've got left. Like the fellow who rang me, you remember? So he knows Donald Trump lies about everything, but he loves it because it upsets people like me and Sadiq Khan. You just think, oh, God, come here. Your little inner child really, really needs a cuddle. But that is all you've got. James Baldwin puts it brilliantly. He wrote, I imagine one of the reasons people cling to their hates so stubbornly is because they sense once hate is gone, they will be forced to deal with pain. That explains so much of recent political developments, and so much of that weird mindset that says, it's not that I actually like Matt Hancock, but I love that it's upsetting you. So you're sitting there thinking, there's someone over there who lost their mum. They couldn't hold their dad's hand at the funeral. And they're absolutely outraged and disgusted that Matt Hancock is now a game show contestant on the telly. And you go, yeah, it's great. I love it because it's really upsetting people like that. That's who James Baldwin is talking about. He's talking about you. The reason you cling to your hate so stubbornly is because you sense that once hate is gone, you'll be forced to deal with your own pain. And it's sense, not know. You don't know it. You just sense it somewhere inside. God, if I stopped actually spitting bile at everybody else, I'd have to have a proper look in that mirror. And that's the other constituency of people that are comfortable with it. Is there enough in the former constituency to make up for the fact that the lot in the second constituency will have moved on to a whole new heap of hatred by tea time tomorrow? Jules is in Swindon. Jules, what's going on?
Hello, mate. Nice to speak to you again. I think that there's another audience that we haven't mentioned yet.
Go on.
From what the gossip, I subscribe to a couple of like showbiz gossip, round robin email type things.
Yeah.
And the word on those is that ever since he left the Department of Health, Hancock has been trawling around pretty much as a couple with his girlfriend for TV work. He's read the writing on the wall. He knows the Tories are doomed at the next election. Or at least
I'm not unfamiliar with this analysis, nor is anybody listening. So, in your view, has he pulled it off?
I think he's in terms of making himself appealing to TV commissioning editors, quite possibly.
Yeah.
I hope I'm wrong. Personally, I would love to see him welcomed back to Heathrow by sort of investigating officers for misconduct in public office with a pair of handcuffs. I don't think it's going to happen.
No, of course it isn't.
But, you know...
And you are calling only for an investigation. You're not making any specific allegations.
No, absolutely not. I think an investigation...
So just briefly then,
certainly enough.
Briefly, what happens there? Because, I mean, you mentioned the third audience of people that he's trying to get a job with, but they don't decide whether or not he's pulled it off or not. They watch to see whether he's pulled it off or not. So what I mean, I'm imagining someone who started watching it, holding Matt Hancock in the very lowest regard, and came away voting for him to stay towards the end or even to win towards the end. What's happened to them?
I wish I have to keep reminding myself that certainly speaking for myself, I suspect speaking for the entire LBC audience, if not 90% of them, we follow politics and current events quite regularly. That's why you listen to a station like this. It's why we listen to your show.
Yeah.
It's why you have a show. Is because there are people out there who do follow this. I think that the Venn diagram of the audience of I'm a Celebrity, Get Me Out of Here, and the Venn diagram of people
politically engaged,
there's quite a small overlap.
It's an interesting point. You have to be careful not to...
People who've seen him on the telly when he was health secretary and now seen him on the telly. Yeah, he's some bloke who's on the telly.
I hear you, and I think usually you'd be right. But the idea that people were not fully engaged with the coronavirus when Matt Hancock was in charge of the country's response to it is, I think, stretching it a little. I mean, maybe they weren't plugged into the granular detail of how bad he was, and they don't associate him personally with the nonsense about a protective ring being put around care homes. But certainly, I mean, you referenced the station and this show. Certainly, in my experience in this job, that was a period of uncommon engagement with government itself, not with politics in general. That absence of clarity anyway, who knows? 12:42 is the time. Rachel Venables has been out with the Just Stop Oil protesters this morning, and they've found a bit of a loophole. Rachel.
They have, although when I asked them if it was a loophole that they'd found, they insisted it wasn't that. But it certainly frustrated the police this morning, who've called what Just Stop Oil have started doing as their third wave of protests. So if you've been following them closely, maybe not quite as closely even as I have, perhaps you'll have noticed that there have been a series of different tactics that they've used throughout the year to try and gain attention. At the start of the year, Just Stop Oil were out trying to break into oil refineries. They were also blockading oil tankers as they drove around London. That didn't work too well when it came to their overall aim, which is trying to force the government to stop new oil and gas projects. So then they moved on to climbing up gantries on the M25. That's what we saw in recent months. That obviously caused huge disruption. It was a huge headache for the police trying to get them down safely and then cart them away and arrest them. They then took a bit of a break for a few weeks, and they've announced they're coming back today up until mid-December. And what I witnessed in and around central London was really interesting. It was a group of around 12 or so protesters walking really slowly in the middle of the road with banners and with placards and basically chanting and shouting out their aims. And that was it. And it meant that central London traffic ground to not a halt, but it was certainly really slowed as this huge swarm of police officers, I'd say maybe 5 or 6 vans and cars, dozens of officers walked alongside them and followed them in procession, unable to arrest the protesters because legally you are allowed to cause a little bit of traffic disruption. And basically by walking through the streets, not halting it, they weren't gluing down to anything, they weren't sitting in the middle of the road, they'd found the right balance between protest and disruption. And the officers who'd gathered en masse this morning couldn't arrest them and couldn't stop them, and it really frustrated the Met Police. I actually spoke to one of the protesters. He's a guy called Sean Irish. He was leading the group in the chants and the shouts as they walked up and down the Strand slowly, and he explained what they were doing and why it's so significant.
We are demanding that the British government immediately halt all new fossil fuel licences. This is in line with the IPCC reports, what their own climate scientists are saying. This government needs to take action. The people of Britain don't want to die for an oil baron's profits. We're in a cost of living crisis, an energy crisis, and oil is not the solution.
And right now you're leading a group of about a dozen protesters. You're walking slowly along the road. Am I right in thinking that by doing this you can't be arrested, or...?
So it varies. It's technically obstruction of the highway, but you do have legal rights in the UK, so your Article 10, Article 11 rights, and then the Ziegler Act does allow demonstrations to happen. The police have forgotten that today, and they have already arrested 2 of us, but they are likely to be released due to it not being a crime to fight for your future.
So at the moment you're doing this as a bit of a loophole, really. You can disrupt the traffic, but you're not gluing yourself down, you're not completely blocking it.
I wouldn't say it's a loophole. This is what people have done for ages. This is how gay people got our rights, this is how women got the right to vote. It's not a loophole. The government would like to call it a loophole. They like to turn us into a fascist state where we have to obey everything they say. But right now the UK is not a fascist state. We still have the right to protest, and we intend to exercise that.
And in the end, the protesters went on their way, James. They walked up and down the Strand a few times. They did a loop around Trafalgar Square. They then walked into a park. The police were able to disperse a little bit. They kept a close eye on them while they sort of sat and gathered and I think had a bit of a debrief. And then they went on their way, no doubt to come back another day. But I was able to speak to Chief Inspector Billy Bowen-Long, who's from the Met Police, and he was able to confirm really that balance that they've managed to find between, of course, the protesters' right to be a little bit annoying, to disrupt a little bit, between, when it goes too far, and that's when arrests would have to happen.
We understand the public frustration, but what we have to show is that disruption is unreasonable. So it would be an arterial road being blocked or an impact on critical services or critical deliveries. But where traffic is flowing and moving, albeit slow, then that's deemed to be a reasonable disruption.
It's fascinating, Rachel, isn't it? So just to clarify for my own non-petrol head sensibilities, they'd still be in all sorts of bother if they tried to do this on a motorway, wouldn't they?
Absolutely, yeah, that was that line, arterial road.
Yeah.
But it's just really fascinating throughout this process, from Extinction Rebellion to Insulate Britain to Just Stop Oil. I've seen how the police really have to grapple with the legislation as it stands, the rights that they do and don't have, and the rights of the protesters and the rights of the public. And it's really complicated, and a lot of the time the officers were saying on the ground they have to make almost split-second, quite difficult decisions that they know can be challenged later.
Yes.
They can't go too heavy-handed, but they also can't be too lax. And they really have to read each situation as it comes, and that's obviously very tricky and challenging for them when you have a group like this who are designed to be spontaneous, are designed to be really tricky and to keep popping up and doing ever more sort of lurid and creative things. And this was really interesting today because it was a lot more, it was toned down from climbing onto an M25 gantry. It still got their name out. It still was a slightly disruptive protest. But as I was there walking, looking at all these officers, thinking, when are they going to start making arrests? It was clear that they decided on this occasion they couldn't.
They're not going to. And that is, as your guest or your contributor pointed out, it's a well-trodden path. I'd still describe it as a loophole in the sense of managing to cause disruption without running the risk of arrest, whereas Just Stop Oil have demonstrated in previous demonstrations that they are not happy to be arrested. Well, sometimes happy to be arrested, but they're more than prepared to be arrested. But I was grateful for the clarification. Rachel, thank you. 12:48 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. I think we've got a bit of Theo Usherwood after this. It's 12:52. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Theo Usherwood is here
to bring you up to date with what's happening when it comes to onshore wind farms. Now, going back to 2015, there was a policy which was introduced by David Cameron, which effectively placed a ban on any more onshore wind farms, because under the planning restrictions that he tightened up, it meant that only one person needed to complain for a wind farm not to go ahead. So we haven't had any more wind farms since then. And this is what Rishi Sunak said during the leadership contest when he appeared to say there would be, if he became Prime Minister, no more onshore wind turbines.
So, yes, in a nutshell, we've already said that we are open to do that, where we can do it with local communities, right? Now, that has proven difficult, but I think actually with the different economic incentives, it might be possible that we can get that to work. We also, ditto, could look at that with fracking, by the way. So that's another thing where, again, if we can do it with local communities, we should look at it. But we can do a couple of other things. I talked about the free ports that I want to bring to Wales. The first one that we set up in Teesside. Offshore wind manufacturing is going gangbusters. GE are investing there and creating jobs because that's a growth industry for us. If we can crack small modular reactors, North Wales is a place where you could do that alongside the big plants. That's how we'll increase homegrown supply of energy. But we can also do something else in the short term. We can make sure that we insulate homes better, because there's a lot of government money and it's not well spent at the moment. And if we can help people with their loft insulation, their cavity wall insulation, temperature controls, relatively simple things that don't take very long, that don't cost a fortune, we can actually save people 300 quid off their energy bills and improve our energy security by reducing demand.
So Rishi Sunak, no more onshore wind farms. But of course we heard...
What is the... opposition? Is it that the rural areas in which they're most likely to feature lend themselves more obviously to Conservative voters?
Yes.
So it is. But then some people, is there a broad consensus against them in areas where they're mooted, or are there just enough people against them to be potentially electorally or votally significant?
It's certainly the latter. The latter is true. So I was interviewing James Gray, the Conservative MP down in North Wiltshire, dead against any onshore wind farms, because he knows that if there were to be an onshore wind farm, he would have to go against government policy, or potentially, and this is where the Liberal Democrats have been very successful in running hyper-local campaigns. We saw it in Chesham and Amersham in the summer gone previously, where they did it on housing and planning reforms, where they took just one housing development and then, of course, made it apply to the government's broader policy of trying to increase housing supply, particularly in the southeast. And therefore, what's happening at the moment is that from what I understand, Rishi Sunak and those in his number 10 team are trying to work out if they go with the likes of Michael Gove, if they go with the likes of Grant Shapps, and of course Simon Clarke, the former Chief Secretary to the Treasury, who has tabled this amendment to the Levelling Up legislation. Are they then going to just trigger an even bigger counter-rebellion from the likes of James Gray and Conservatives in southeast, southwest seats who are vehemently opposed to these wind farms? What is the payoff, and do they just make their own position worse by suddenly giving way to a counter-rebellion? And that's what Rishi Sunak doesn't want to happen. But from what I've been picking up, they are minded now to, in effect, relinquish that ban on onshore wind farms and press ahead with it. And that change could come by Christmas.
To avoid the debate, even. So it's 2 for 2, isn't it?
Yes. Well, you don't have it.
They're 2 for 2 on whispers of a mooted rebellion, and he's rolled over. If he does roll over again, it's 2 for 2. Because what was the last one again?
Well, there was COP27. Was he going to go, and then he decided to go?
That. Last week there was one where they were going to have a debate about it in the House of Commons.
There's the planning numbers. So
it's part of the same bill.
Yes, part of the same legislation. So they were
twice now that there have been rumours of a looming
rebellion
and the rumours of a rebellion, and he rolls over and avoids it completely.
So 2 U-turns on one piece of legislation is going some, yes.
Fantastic.
Because, of course, but that's from the other wing of the party, James. That's from the wing of the party that doesn't want houses being built in greenbelt land or in the southeast of England. And they're saying you can't have these housing targets because then we'll end up with more houses being built. So it's 2 for 2, but it's from different wings of the party. So on the one hand, you've got the quote-unquote not in my backyards winning on housing reform. On the other hand, you've got, well, actually, we need to
the not in my backyard's losing on wind farms.
And is he worried? Is he worried enough about the not in my backyards to actually?
Why are they in different constituencies? I mean, not as in parliamentary constituencies, but why is house building not the same as wind farm building, wind turbine building? Because it's likely to affect the same areas. It's going to be areas where
So broadly speaking, it's because, and this is something that's been discussed internally, certainly with the Conservatives, they're appealing in the South to Liberal Democrats, they're facing Sir Ed Davies' party in the southeast of England and the southwest of England, and then they're facing red wall Labour seats in the north of England and the Midlands. And the problem that Rishi Sunak is finding is a problem which Boris Johnson managed to deal with successfully by winning in 2019, but he is effectively trying to unite two different parts of the country so that he can bring in cheaper energy, where we are energy independent.
He's flip-flopped as well, desperately,
of course he
Johnson himself.
Well, he said when it came to onshore wind, when he was mayor of London, they wouldn't have enough power to take the skin off a rice pudding.
And they've never been banned in Scotland, I don't think.
No, I don't think so.
No, so they've carried on anyway. That's it from me for another day. Remember, you can download the entire show if you've missed any of it at Global Player, where you'll also find all the podcasts and stay up to date with the latest news from LBC. You can download it for free from your app store or at globalplayer.com. Tom Swarbrick will be here at 4, but now it's Sheila Fogarty. 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 But now it's